Hey everyone!
Hello.
Welcome!
Hi.
What's up, guys? Welcome to
Hi.
8th grade English Language Arts. We are going to have an awesome class diving into some more of the themes of the Scarlet Letter.
Nancy.
Right, so awesome to see all of you guys. Thanks for making it into class today for the Scarlet Letter. We are going to be looking especially at Chapter 1, the Prison Door. So, please tell me. There is no one in the waiting room right now, so just we'll make sure everybody rolls in. So, tell me honestly, how many of you read Chapter 1? So that was our homework assigned on Tuesday to read Chapter 1 of the Scarlet Letter, The Prison Door by today. So you can private message me in the chat to tell me. And just be super honest, like, yes, I did the reading, or no, I did not. So there shouldn't be, if your answer is no because I don't have the book, remember I gave you a link to the text online, so you could have read it online. All right, so if forgetting is why you didn't read it, that tells you something about yourself as a student. Like, hey, I might need a little bit of an extra reminder. Totally makes sense, right? If someone is like, oh, I'm not gonna be there that day, I'm always like, hey, that's cool, but please like send it to me in an email or text me or something so I have it written. It's in one ear and out the other. That's a totally common thing with us people. So no worries if you forgot, that just means that you have to go an extra step as yourself as a student and write it down. Take a note, put it as a reminder in your phone. Set a reminder like, okay, 7 p.m. Tuesday night, I want to get a reminder that says, hey, you've got some homework. Like, set aside 45 minutes and do the reading. You'll read it after class. Fabulous. Okay, thank you. That's what I like to hear. And remember, I sent you guys that link to the No Fear translation. So on the left-hand side, it's going to say the original text by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And then on the right side, it has the more modern translation. So what's going to make more sense to us as contemporary English speakers. So go ahead and read both. I would say always start with the Nathaniel Hawthorne and then kind of read it in the modern day vernacular just to kind of help clarify the meaning for yourself. But Nathaniel Hawthorne, his imagery, it is rich. It is a lushly written book. So I'd encourage you, challenge yourself. You guys have totally got this. Yes, we're talking about Chapter 1. Last time we talked about the Custom House. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 1. Another little note before we dive into our content for the day. You guys are, what, like 12, 13, 14 years old? We're in middle school now, so we're getting to the age where you have got to start taking some ownership for your education. You're not always going to have a teacher looking over your shoulder being like, okay, are you doing your work? Like, did you fill it out? Did you turn it in? Did you have a parent sign it? The older you get, the less of that kind of monitoring is going to happen, which means if you care about your education, which I really hope that you do, you're going to have to start taking some responsibility. And if you have aspirations to, take some AP classes in high school or get a high GPA, if you want to go to college, let me tell you now, you're not going to get to reach those goals if you don't really start to apply yourself. And there are ways that you can kind of like do the least amount of work possible or kind of cheat your way out of things. Sure, I guess, but ultimately the only person you're cheating is yourself. So this is just me on my little soapbox saying, please take this seriously because it's only going to help you. So with all of that out of the way, let's dive in for those of you who maybe did read and tell me, what happened in chapter 1? And if you could all turn your webcams on, that would be great. You can stay muted, but I would like to be able to see you. Thank you.
Whenever my things are ready, because food is all about. Yeah.
So what happened in chapter 1? Who did we finally meet after the Custom House chapter? And I see the comment about there is going to be a new Google Classroom. Hester probably, not probably, yes, it was Hester. And who does she have, who is with Hester? For those of you who did the reading, please do not be shy. We're just looking for some basic comprehension. No one. It probably feels like no one is with her, but she actually has her baby daughter with her in the prison. And then what happens at the beginning of this chapter, or during this chapter? It's not about her going to prison, it's about her what?
Getting out.
Getting out. Yeah, it's about her leaving, getting out of her confinement that she's been in for a very long time. So just to give you a little bit of a visual, actually, let me pull up the right tab first. So here we have the prison door. That's probably something along the lines of what it looked like. Heavy wooden, very little sunlight, very isolated. And then here is an artist's rendition of what it might have looked like for Hester to kind of make her way out of the prison door for the first time with her infant child and all those people in the back. Not approving of her, looking at her with a lot of disdain and disgust and hate. So what I'd like us to think about today is Hester was in jail, in prison for adultery. And she was kept, aside from the presence of her baby and the occasional guard who would, come to bring her food, she was completely alone. So months and months of no one else to talk to, no one to discuss her feelings and ideas with, no one to interact with, no one to touch, no one to hold, completely alone. What do you think an experience like that would do to a human person? What would that be like to be so isolated from any sort of social interaction?
Make you go crazy?
Absolutely. I mean, maybe you guys are even starting to feel it now. It's like, it's weird. We're practicing social distancing. We are intentionally keeping a distance from each other. But hey, look at this awesome technology we have that we are still connected. We're able to communicate, to share ideas, to kind of feel like we're still together. Hester didn't have any of that. They were purposely isolating her. Yeah, like an insane asylum. People actually start to lose their minds. They lose their sense of who they are when they are on their own. Humans are supposed to live in community, and we thrive off of relationship. If we are cut off from all of that, I mean, as bad as it was later for Hester to be socially shamed with the Scarlet A, I think there's a pretty strong argument to be made that what was done to her before with the complete separation was even worse in a lot of ways, to just be utterly alone. So what I would like to do is listen to a podcast with you guys about the actual effects on your brain when you are in solitary confinement. I think you're going to find it super, super interesting. So I would love it if everybody could get out something to take notes with. I would like you to kind of note the things that seem most important, the things that sort of stand out to you. So here we are. This is an NPR podcast, Inside the Hole, What Happens to the Mind in Isolation? Imagine a concrete room, not much bigger than a parking space, no window. You're in there 23 hours a day, 7 days a week. You don't know when you'll get out of this room. A month, a year, a decade? Our minds don't do very well with that kind of solitude and uncertainty. Karen Ryder, a criminology professor at UC Irvine, hey, shout out, has spent more than a decade researching solitary confinement. In her new book, 23/7, Pelican Bay Prison and the Rise of Long-Term Solitary Confinement, she writes about the lives of people who end up in solitary units for some years. Ryder says inmates living in isolation crave things we might take for granted, such as the touch of another person or the sight of the moon. They often find it hard to differentiate one day from the next because the lights are always on in their cells. How disorienting. Tracking weeks, months, or even years often becomes difficult. In recent years, both liberals and conservatives, worried about the psychological and financial costs of long-term solitary confinement, have raised questions about the practice. This week on Hidden Brain, we look at what happens inside the prison cells few ever see, and the psychological effects of being alone for long periods of time.
This is Hidden Brain. I'm Shankar Vedantam.
All right. And next up, we have Diana shouting out to the Polanski unit.
I'm going to pause it just for a sec. Can everyone hear? Awesome. Okay.
Hito, it's Mama D. I know I sound kind of different. I'm very sick right now. Got diagnosed with pneumonia. I've been sick already for quite some time now.
This is the voice of a woman calling into a radio show on the Texas station KPFA. She has a personal message for a prison inmate.
Anyway, I want to tell you, Hito, that Mama D loves you. I always think of you. And it's just getting harder and harder. I know I'm not supposed to cry because you're going to get mad at me, but I can't help but feel so much love for you.
Calling into a program like this is one of the few ways for spouses and parents and children to communicate with prisoners, especially inmates in solitary confinement. Many prisoners in solitary have been found guilty of heinous crimes, including murder, rape, terrorism. But here's something you might not know. Some are there because they're difficult to manage or because of bureaucratic inertia. While judges and juries decide whether someone should go to prison, a decision that can be appealed in court, typically it's prison officials who decide whether someone should be in solitary confinement. In recent years, both liberals and conservatives, worried about the psychological and financial costs of long-term solitary confinement, have raised questions about the practice. This week on Hidden Brain, we thought we'd take a look at what happens inside the prison cells that few people ever see, and the psychological effects of being alone for long periods of time.
Support for this NPR podcast and the following message come from Blue Apron. Blue Apron partners with sustainable farms, fisheries, and ranchers to bring you all the ingredients and exploring new flavors and cuisines. Get your first
And the rise of long-term solitary confinement. Besides being a researcher, she's also been a prisoners' rights activist at Human Rights Watch. Karamit, welcome to Hidden Brain.
Thanks for having me, Shankar.
You can't tell the story of solitary confinement without understanding the story of a man named George Jackson. He was sent to prison in the early 1960s after pleading guilty to armed robbery, and he was sentenced to a term of 1 year to life. What was the thinking behind this kind of indeterminate sentence?
So the idea for someone like George Jackson was that he would go to prison and he'd have to prove that he'd been rehabilitated before he could get out of prison.
Around the time Jackson went to prison, however, people started to look at these indeterminate sentences and realize that they were having truly disproportionate impacts depending on the race of the person with the sentence. So white people had a much easier time convincing prison officials that they had been reformed and should be let out of prison than African-American men like George Jackson happened to be. So George Jackson found himself essentially stuck in prison. Years went by when he was denied parole, and he became radicalized in this process. He wrote a book of best-selling letters that achieved national and international acclaim, letters to his family and to his lawyers, articulating his revolutionary politics and the problems with things like this indeterminate sentence. This brought him to the attention of prison officials, and he was accused of murdering a prison guard in the early 1970s. And he was preemptively sent to death row at San Quentin while he awaited a death penalty trial for that murder he was accused of. And while on death row at San Quentin, in an isolation unit, interestingly, one day his lawyer came in to visit him. And the story that prison officials tell, and it's been repeated many times, is that his lawyer snuck a 9mm gun into him inside of a tape recorder, and that Jackson then used that gun to try to escape from this isolation unit. All we actually know is that he was shot to death on the San Quentin prison yard as he ran out of the isolation unit. And when staff ran into the unit to see what had happened, they found 3 officers and 2 more prisoners who'd been stabbed to death. So this was the most violent day in California's prison history ever, 6 deaths total on August 21st, 1971. And this moment is a moment that people point to in California as incredibly important in understanding why the state needed long-term solitary confinement units. And similar things happened across the US, and prison officials in other states point to those moments. So 2 weeks after George Jackson died, the revolt at Attica happened. Similarly, following that, prisoners were locked into their cells, and that became a moment people pointed to as a justification for really long-term solitary confinement.
You also tell the story of a prison administrator, Carl Larson, who began his career the same year that George Jackson went to prison. I understand you interviewed Carl Larson, and his view gives us a glimpse into the other side of the story, how prison guards and prison officials see the need for solitary confinement.
So Carl Larson was one of the earlier people I interviewed in doing this work, and to my surprise, we got to be friends. I came at this work from a perspective of a prisoner's rights advocate, very critical of the system, but as I got to know Carl Larson, I saw that he had a really interesting perspective on the system, and he was one of the first people to point me to the story of George Jackson and to explain how scary it was to be a guard working in the California prisons in the 1970s when these deaths were happening, and to make that fear real for me in a way that helped me to understand why he thought a long-term solitary confinement facility made sense. So Carl Larson is particularly interesting because, as you said, he started out as an officer in the 1970s in California prisons, actually even earlier, and then he worked his way up through the system, becoming a warden, and then becoming head of the prison construction projects that California engaged in the 1980s when the state built one of these long-term solitary confinement supermax facilities. And he takes credit for designing one of the first of these institutions. And that's really interesting because he's a prison administrator. He's not an architect. He's not an expert in exactly what kinds of punishments work. He didn't have a law degree. He had just worked in prisons, and he designed this completely new facility.
I understand that there were some interesting architectural features of this facility, Pelican Bay. The cement for the facility was poured in one large block, and so that the cells were not built in individual units.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that's striking about the place is it's made of these poured concrete cells, so they're incredibly easy to hose down, which is the fact that they can stay clean is important because courts earlier had criticized isolation units for being really dirty. And they're grouped together into these pods of 8, and then the pods of 8 are grouped together again into these tessellated T structures so that one officer can look out over 6 pods of cells at a time. So it's a modern panopticon, and that allows the fact that there are no windows makes it really easy to just fit all these blocks together, if you can imagine that structure.
I'm wondering, Kermit, if you can actually just describe what one of these cells looks like. Give me a sense of what's in the cell, how big it is. What does it actually feel like to be in one of these units?
So the cells in these units are generally about 8 by 10 feet. So imagine a wheelchair accessible bathroom stall or a generous parking space. Pretty small. You can almost reach from one end of the cell to the other, and they're fairly self-contained. So they contain a poured concrete ledge with a very thin piece of foam over it, and that's the bed. And then there's another sort of concrete bit protruding that is a desk and seat combination. So it's just like a concrete block that a prisoner could sit on and write there. And then there's in another corner, there's a steel, usually toilet sink combination. So it's just, one smooth steel object that has running water and plumbing for the prisoner. Sometimes there are showers in these cells, but generally it's just a sink and a toilet. And again, if the prisoner is lucky and they can afford it and the system they're in allows it, they might have a TV or a radio. And usually they're allowed maybe a few books at a time and a little bit of paper for writing letters or doing legal paperwork.
You say in the book that despite what prison officials say, it's not always the worst of the worst who end up in solitary confinement. But in general, are there patterns to predict who ends up in solitary confinement?
There's been shockingly little research over time on who ends up in solitary confinement and how, and it's very hard to track across states. But as people have paid more attention to this, and through the work I've done, I've started to see some patterns. There's a disproportionate racial impact of solitary confinement. So we know that in our prisons in general, African Americans and Latinos are more likely to be in prison than in the general prison population. They're doubly likely, again, to be in solitary confinement than even the general prison population. And that's often because gang members are being targeted for long-term isolation, especially in states like California. Prison systems are not putting people there based on some act or rule that they broke, but based on their status as dangerous. So prisoners get labeled dangerous gang members and they get sent to isolation indefinitely. In general, I think one way to think about people who end up in isolation is that it's often the people who are really difficult for the system to manage. So that might include seriously mentally ill prisoners. There's recent research showing that transgender prisoners are really likely to end up in isolation, that pregnant women end up there. So people who the system just isn't equipped to provide resources to can end up there also.
So the rise of these institutions coincided in some ways with the decline or closing down of various institutions for the mentally ill, which speaks, of course, to the point that you're just making. But I also understand that this is reflected in the number of suicides we see in solitary confinement compared to the general prison population.
Mm-hmm. There is a very close relationship between solitary confinement and mental illness. One way to understand that is that in the 1970s and early 80s, when mental institutions closed, was the same time that mass incarceration and rates of incarceration were increasing across the United States. And that meant that some mentally ill people, unsurprisingly, ended up in prisons. And one of the arguments I make is that as those people ended up in prison, they tended to be put into solitary confinement. And that's one explanation for the fact that rates of suicide in solitary confinement can be twice as high as in the general prison population, or even higher. And that rates of mental illness in isolation can be high. And often there's a real chicken and egg problem of, did a person get sent to isolation because they were mentally ill? And states have tried to limit that. Or do people in isolation develop mental illnesses?
Most of us are never going to see the inside of a supermax, but we often do see scenes of solitary confinement described in pop culture. One of those examples is the TV show Orange is the New Black. We have a bit of tape. The character Piper is put into a security housing unit and starts speaking to a voice she hears through the grate of her cell.
How long have you been down here?
I lost track. I don't know. 9 months? A year?
A year? That's insane.
They keep the lights on. They lose all sense of time. It's not living. Yeah, you're breathing. Can't help the person no more. It's bad. You start to see shit that ain't there. You start to hear voices.
Oh my God.
Keep you here until they break you.
I feel like I'm gonna throw up.
Karamet, I'm wondering how accurate that description is of what life's actually like in solitary confinement.
I do think that the disembodied voice that you hear talking to Piper is accurate on a number of levels. The voice is kind of flattened in affect, and the prisoner was describing hearing voices, hallucinations. That's a very common side effect of isolation. And people talk about time, the way they perceive time changing because there is no way to mark time. People talk about it exactly as that prisoner said. It's not that it even feels long. It's just that it's almost endless. That days can kind of, in a weird, counterintuitive way, fly by because there's nothing marking anything about a day or a week. So in that sense, it's accurate.
I want to spend a moment talking about your own role in looking at this. On the one hand, you're a researcher who has spent time studying the question, but as you yourself have said, you're also a prison rights advocate. You've been an activist at Human Rights Watch and other organizations. How do you preserve your ability to be analytical about the subject while you also have what are very clearly strong views about solitary confinement?
When I went to interview Carl Erson, he said, well, you're a Berkeley liberal. so he asked me to do some background reading and prove that I was serious, and I would listen to him. And so I actually think in the process of doing this work, I have become more open-minded and been criticized by advocates for talking so directly and so extensively to prison officials. And so I've had the interesting experience of trying to keep the conversation open across a really broad spectrum of perspectives on this process. And I think in that way, I've been able to try to at least incorporate these different perspectives and tease apart the arguments and the positions people are coming from. And I do think that in reform, prison officials have to walk into these institutions and engage with these prisoners day in and day out, and they also need to be part of the reform conversation. And through this process, surprisingly, even though I came basically from the other side, if you want to think of it in terms of sides, I've come to see that perspective.
When we come back, I'm going to ask Karamet about the psychological toll of solitary confinement and the unexpected ways inmates manage life in isolation. Stay with us.
Support for this podcast and the
Thrives. I can't have it all. Well, with the new, I can hear that engine noise. You get that visceral kind of feel, and you.
This is Hidden Brain. I'm Shankar Vedantam. Karamet, what sorts of things do people in solitary confinement say they miss? What are the kind of things that you miss that the rest of us might not think about?
So people talk about not having seen the moon in years or decades and how much they miss that. And then people talk about missing just pure human touch. And I tell a story in the book about a prisoner who his cell door and the cell door of the prisoner next to him were accidentally opened at the same time. And they were rival gang members, but they had been talking to each other, shouting through the cell walls. And when the cell doors opened, they just reached around and grabbed each other's hands and held on because it had been so long since either of them had had a gentle human touch like that.
Prisoners often stay alone in their cells for 22 or 23 hours a day, and you found that perhaps the only way to actually manage this psychologically is to stick to a series of very, very rigid routines. Tell me about those routines.
The prisoners who I was able to interview in this research to understand their experiences tended to be the prisoners who survived. And so they did develop all kinds of coping mechanisms. And one of the ones I heard about again and again was that they would wake up at, first thing in the morning, 5 a.m., and they would do thousands of repetitive exercises, often what prisoners call burpees. So a combination of jumping jacks, push-ups, and sit-ups. And literally a few thousand in the morning to start out their day. And then clean their cells, write letters, work on legal cases. And in general, in these units, if prisoners are following the rules and they have money being sent in from family, they can buy either a TV or a radio. And prisoners who develop these routines talk about really limiting the time they spent listening to media. So maybe only an hour a day or 2 hours a day or a special show they like to watch, so that they were keeping both their bodies and their minds really busy consciously over the course of a day. And interestingly, prisoners talk about having trouble letting go of these routines once they got out of prison, that they would still do those thousands of burpees every morning at 5 a.m. when they got up, and that their ability to control everything in their space in that 8 by 10 cell they live in is also hard to let go of. That they could keep, a prisoner described to me how he could keep the cap of his toothpaste perfectly clean, and it was really hard when he had a roommate when he got out of prison, the fact that he couldn't control the cap of the toothpaste anymore. So kind of gives you a sense of how intense it is to survive, and then how long those coping mechanisms linger afterwards.
You talk in the book, Karamet, about inmates trying a number of different things to not just be physically active and mentally active, but emotionally expressive, to try and find ways to do artistic things. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Prisoners do struggle to find ways to express themselves. Sometimes that's becoming really good at the law and litigating cases, but very often it's teaching themselves to draw, sometimes teaching themselves to speak a new language, sometimes teaching themselves to sew. One of my favorite stories was a prisoner who told me that he was in isolation for a number of months, and I'm not even sure how he made himself a needle. I know that he pulled threads out of the jumpsuits they're given in order to make thread, and then he started tailoring his clothes so that they fit better. They're often given these very loose jumpsuits, and so he would add cuffs or shorten the sleeves. And I think other prisoners found out about him doing this, and in some cases, a friendly officer would pass a uniform back and forth, and he started tailoring other people's uniforms. It's kind of, not that anyone is even seeing them, but it's this amazing kind of self-expression and community that they're managing to create in this place.
I'm sure there are going to be people who say, look, there are lots of people in these units who really are the worst of the worst. Maybe not all of them are, but some of them probably are. Some of them probably are really violent and really dangerous and ought to be there. And I'm wondering, do you ever feel that they might be people who need to be in solitary confinement?
So there are certainly people in isolation who are dangerous. One of the really important points of analysis is the length of time people are spending in isolation. The fact that people, we're not talking about weeks or months, we're talking about years and decades often. And that even people who might have been fairly scary or dangerous in their 20s are unlikely to be that way into their 40s and 50s. And as we look at decades of these policies, we see that even some of the people who have been held up as the scariest, the system didn't control them very well while they were in it, and they're doing surprisingly well outside of isolation. So it really does call the practice into question on all different levels.
So your book comes at a time when many liberals and conservatives have joined hands to call for prison reform. For one thing, keeping people in prison and keeping someone in solitary confinement is very, very expensive. Give us a sense of how expensive it is and whether these ideological pairings are triggering any change in the system.
So solitary confinement is astronomically expensive. In states like California, it costs about $45,000 per prisoner per year to keep someone in the general prison population. Right. And it costs about $90,000 per prisoner per year to keep someone in isolation. So the cost of running the facilities is really expensive because these prisoners in isolation, every need has to be met by someone working in the prison, whether it's delivering mail or delivering legal documents or getting them a meal. So that's how the costs go up. And the costs of the facilities are also expensive to build these kinds of technologically advanced facilities, and that's not even wrapped into that per prisoner per year cost. So I think that has been part of the reform conversation, as you suggest, that perhaps there might be a less expensive way to do this work. One other cost of isolation is that the vast majority of people, even from long-term solitary confinement, ultimately get out of prison. It's 95 to 98% of all prisoners get out eventually, and that's surprisingly true of people in isolation too. And so there's the question of what are the social impacts of letting people out. And I think in combination, those economic costs and the social costs, people are beginning to think about alternatives. And that is a conversation that crosses political lines. And prison, as I suggested in many states, legislators are initiating reforms. Some litigation has happened, but in many states, prison officials within the system are looking at the norms changing and the critiques of this practice and initiating their own reforms, saying, what can we do to reduce our reliance on this practice?
Karen Ryder is a professor at the University of California at Irvine. She is the author of the book 23/7, Pelican Bay Prison and the Rise of Long-Term Solitary Confinement. Karen, thank you for joining me on Hidden Brain today.
Thanks for having me.
Hidden Brain is projected.
All right. So, I know that was a lot to process there. Tell me, what are a couple of takeaways, things that stood out to you guys while we were listening to that? Feel free to use the chat or to unmute. Yeah, oh my gosh, that moment, what she described, the gang members holding hands, absolutely. At that point, they are just so starved for any sort of human contact that they're willing to take the hand of someone who was once their total enemy. So that just shows you depriving people of human relationship will cause that sort of desperation. Yeah, the fact they can stay in for decades, it's mind-boggling. Yeah, there was that one particularly violent day in prison that they described. So I actually wrote in college my senior thesis, partly about the criminal justice system, and learned a lot about the effects of solitary confinement, and it is very, very sad that a lot of people come out of it just changed for life, to the point that a lot of them end up committing suicide because they can't handle the mental turmoil they're living in. Right, they might start hearing voices. The one guy who learned to sew, now that's interesting. Let's think about that. So imagine the mental determination it would take to wake yourself up every day at 5 a.m., work out, clean your living space, consume just small amounts of media. I mean, you could totally turn into like a couch potato just watching TV all day, but the ones who kind of make it out with the most mental health still intact are the ones who really make a concerted effort to stay on a schedule. Yeah, learning a new language. I don't know how we got a needle, that's a little concerning. But the ones who have something to live for, because if you are just day in, day out in that cage, you're gonna lose your hope. And without hope, I mean, there really isn't much to life. So again, let's keep on topic. Think about Hester. While Hester is in her solitary confinement, as it were, what do you think they're hoping she's gonna be like when she comes out? Remember, they put her there because who do we put in solitary confinement? We put people who we don't know how to deal with, that hands off, we don't know what to do. So yeah, they would want her to come out changed. Like, okay, she was clearly, the spawn of Satan when we put her in there. She's gonna come out after all of that time, and she is going to be, meek and mild and calm, and just will totally know how to deal with Hester once she's kind of gone through this ordeal. But as we are going to see as we continue reading, she might not be the meek, mild, and perfectly well-behaved person that they are hoping that she became. So what does that tell us about Hester? It tells us that she's got a very strong will, a very determined personality. And what does Hester have to live for? Or who does Hester have to live for?
Her kid.
Her baby, absolutely. I don't know what Hester's confinement would have been like had she not had this human life that was now completely dependent upon her. And so that is kind of what we saw in the podcast, or heard rather in the podcast too, is the guys who come out with, you know, hope for the future are the ones who have something to live for. They've got a new hobby. They've got a new interest, maybe in the law or art or learning a language, like you guys said, or sewing, something to take up their time to give them a purpose. Having a purpose in life is key. And so for Hester, her purpose became her kid, is taking care of her kid, providing for her kid, being a role model and example for her kid. Because without her daughter, whose name is Pearl, things could have been a lot different for her. So think about it. If you were in solitary confinement, for you personally, what do you think would be the hardest part? And I didn't even think about, gosh, like not seeing the moon for 10 years. I mean, we take that for granted. Or, you know, daylight, or having the freedom to pull out your phone and text your friend. Like, all of that is gone. Fresh air, absolutely. Like, even if you're cooped up in the car or in a classroom for a couple of hours, it's like, oh my gosh, I just need to get out of here and get some fresh air. That's not an option if you're in solitary. What other ideas do we have? What would be the most difficult part if you were in solitary? Not knowing what time of day it is. Yeah, that would probably stress me out. Like, oh gosh, has it been 10 minutes? Has it been an hour? I don't know. Yeah, not having a sense of time, very disorienting, would really warp with you. Missing Xbox, okay. I feel like there's probably more important things than that. Yeah, your family members, missing people, no human contact whatsoever. Your hygiene, that's a good point too. I mean, she was talking about the one little section for toilet and sink, and that's it. And think about Hester, this is taking place 400 years ago. Hygiene was already kind of a problem for everybody back in those days. And now you imagine a woman who's just given birth to a baby in a small, dank, dark cell. Ooh, this is not a sanitary, clean, inviting space at all. You can imagine the smell. It's not a pleasant place for her to be living. And so when she emerges from the prison door, they're all hoping that she is going to be, you know, downtrodden and distraught. But actually, for those of you who read, and it's funny, they talked about learning to sew in prison. That is exactly what Hester was doing when she was in her solitary confinement. She took the letter A that they gave her, and she actually decorated it. So even before she's released from prison, she's already finding ways of kind of being like, well, I'll show you. You're going to make me wear this A. I'm going to make it like bedazzled. So that irritates people. The second she leaves prison, they're like, did you see what she did to the Scarlet A? She took what was supposed to be this horrible punishment, and she's like throwing it back in our faces. So she took her, yeah, what a baller, for real though. She took this horrible situation and started to, you know, give herself some power. Yes, I don't imagine there was a lot of medical treatment for people in prisons back then, or mental issues. Yeah, not at all. She was really on her own, but she did her best using the tools she had, a needle and some thread, to start embroidering that A and showing them, like, I'm not going to come out of jail and be your, you know, goody two-shoes, well-behaved, oh, I'm so sorry for what I did. She's not that sorry. She's got her baby to live for, and she is going to make a point that her time in jail is not going to define her. She's got more to live for. She's got more things to do, and she's not going to let these people step on her. She's going to be strong. And that takes, as we've seen, a ton of mental will and determination. And yes, I imagine it would be nice. She would be happy to be outside finally. She's got a chance to show them what she's made of. So thank you all for listening to that podcast. I know it was pretty heavy. For next class, we are going to be reading chapter 2. So chapter 2, we're going to find out more about what happens to Hester after she has left solitary confinement. She's back in society. She's changed, but maybe she hasn't changed in the way that all of the people there were hoping she would have changed. So do we have any questions, concerns about the task, reading chapter 2? We should all have access to the book in some format. No?
I have a question about the map.
Yes.
How do we turn that in?
You can take a picture of it and then upload it, although stay tuned because there's going to be a new Google Classroom. So, but you'll probably end up just taking a picture and then emailing the file. Okay. Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
Awesome. All right, well, fabulous job today, you guys. Thanks for participating, and I will see you all later.